Welcome to the first Stopping the Spin response session, hosted by the John Muir Project and collaborators. This series aims to address the misinformation and omissions present in the Forest Service's SCIENCEx webinars, offering a space for critical discussion and evidence-based perspectives that are absent from their panel discussions. Yesterday's webinar, Fuels Management in Dry Frequent Fire Conifer Forests, was dominated by Forest Service-affiliated voices and a single perspective. Despite the opportunity for open discussion, questions that challenged the dominant narrative were dismissed as, quote, agenda-driven. This lack of exchange underscores the importance of creating a platform like ours to share what the Forest Service won't and to provide the public with a fuller understanding of the state of the science.
Welcome, everyone, to a special webinar where we try to address the misinformation and omissions that just occurred in a Forest Service webinar series, their SCIENCEx webinar series. And today, January 16th, 2025, they had a panel called Fuel Management in Dry Frequent Fire Conifer Forests. And the purpose of this webinar that we're putting on here, I think, was really illustrated during their presentation. Not only was the content of the speakers entirely geared towards, well, it was almost entirely Forest Service people, and I think the one or two exceptions were people closely aligned with the Forest Service. It was a single perspective. It was not an exchange of differing ideas and trying to get towards a better understanding. It was a single perspective. Yet, ironically, the moderator for that webinar said, as they moved into what was supposed to be a large discussion period, that she wouldn't take any, quote, agenda-driven questions or anything basically that was questioning the dominant narrative. And so I think this shows the need for a space like this to get out the information to the public about what the Forest Service is not telling you about the state of the science. The one other thing I will say is, of course, it's hard not to look at this in light of what's going on with the fires moving through Los Angeles. And for me, it's especially frustrating to think about, it's especially frustrating to think about how much the wildfire policy narrative in the US has been distorted in terms of attention, in terms of resources, away from communities like Los Angeles and the home outward strategies that can do a lot to protect communities and help communities safely coexist with fire-dependent ecosystems. And instead, so much of the attention, so much of the resources goes to these logging projects on national forests under the rubric of addressing fire. And a lot of that has its origin in the dry conifer forests. And so to on this day, to hear the Forest Service sort of doubling down on this location that's been the origin of a highly misguided and damaging policy for the US was particularly troubling. So with that, let me turn to our panelists. I'll ask you to introduce yourselves when you speak. And I was hoping you could each go through and share what stood out for you as some of the biggest misinformation, misrepresentations that you saw in those presentations. And also, were there important things that were omitted that the public needs to know to get to good, effective fire policy? So why don't we start with Chad Hanson?
Thank you. I'm Dr. Chad Hanson, a forest and fire ecologist with the John Muir Project. And before I get into some of the key points of omission in today's presentation or webinar by the Forest Service, I do want to echo Doug's comment. The thing that struck me the most, honestly, today was the intention of the Forest Service to double down on steering attention and resources of wildland fire management into logging on national forests, as opposed to focusing on creating fire-safe communities and keeping people safe from fire. And most of those communities that are at risk are not near or in forests, as we're seeing right now, tragically, in Los Angeles. So I think it's important to say that, because I think we need a fundamental shift in the way we focus our resources and attention on wildland fire management. But moving beyond that, here are a few things that struck me, and mostly they're just glaring, repeated omissions of large bodies of scientific evidence, including many different scientific studies authored by Forest Service scientists who were not mentioned and not included in today's Forest Service panel. Number one, the refusal to acknowledge literally half a century of scientific studies, mostly by Forest Service and National Park Service scientists, showing that if you want fire in the landscape, you can do that without any prior tree removal whatsoever. You can do it during fire season. You can do it in the densest forests imaginable. You can do it in forests that haven't burned in well over a century. The research is there. It goes back to the 1960s and 1970s. And I posted a link to a fact sheet on that's on the John Muir Project's website in the chat, but people can find it on the John Muir Project's website. The second one that struck me was the absolute refusal of the panelists to talk about the tree mortality caused by thinning itself. This is a huge source of tree mortality and a major scientific omission that, frankly, is just institutional dishonesty for the agency to say that these thinning projects, produce a certain outcome in terms of tree mortality and wildland fire, but not mention the fact that they killed 60, 70, 80% of the trees with their chainsaws before the fire got there. That is just dishonest, fundamentally. And that's a major thing. We call that cumulative tree mortality, cumulative severity. We've used a number of different terms, but it all amounts to the same thing. It's accounting for tree mortality and carbon removal from the forest from thinning itself. They just completely refuse to talk about that. And it's a form of climate denialism, really, because it leads me to the third one, which is related, which is there's an abundant science that shows that thinning emits 3 times, 5 times, or more carbon per acre, CO2, into the atmosphere per acre than fire alone. And they just refuse to talk about that. They even tried to misrepresent it at one point, alluding to a couple of theoretical modeling studies that have been wildly discredited by subsequent empirical research. And so, that's a form of climate change denialism that is really, frankly, dangerous right now, because really what they're talking about is removing vast amounts of carbon from the forest and putting most of it in the atmosphere, and they're not talking about the consequences of that. The last two I'll mention briefly is they omitted mention of vast bodies of scientific evidence that the historical forests and frequent fire forest types were actually much denser on average than the Forest Service has been trying to claim in their political narrative. And in some research finding that these frequent fire forest types were 7 to 17 times denser in terms of trees per acre than the Forest Service falsely claimed. That is unrebutted in the scientific literature. And the last one I'll mention is just the repeated demonization of high intensity fire patches. There is universal acknowledgement in the scientific peer-reviewed literature that high-intensity fire patches, large and small, were a natural part of historical fire regimes in frequent fire forest types. The Forest Service scientists themselves have acknowledged this, many of them, and also that these patches of high-intensity fire are incredibly biodiverse, and many plant and animal species, native species, depend on those patches. They depend on dead trees or the native flowering shrubs that germinate after high-intensity fire. No acknowledgement of that, really. They just completely either pretended like high intensity fire didn't exist historically, it was only something to be prevented, or that it's some sort of loss of the forest if it happens. That is one of the most glaring scientific misrepresentations and omissions that I saw, because literally they're denying hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific studies, which we've discussed and summarized in, for example, our forest and fire ecology textbook. Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix, that Dr. Dominic De La Sala and I co-edited and co-authored with a lot of other scientists. I'll just leave it there for now, but I think that for me, that's the overview of the main omissions and misrepresentations that were really just kind of shocking, and their refusal to answer questions pointing out those scientific omissions and mischaracterizations.
Thank you, Chad. Why don't we turn now to Sam Hitt? Could you introduce yourself and then share your thoughts from that?
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me. I really appreciate it. It was a very interesting discussion. I have been involved in forest issues here in the Southwest since the early 1980s. I founded a group called Forest Guardians back then. It's now WildEarth Guardians, doing quite well, doing conservation work. I now run a small group called Santa Fe Forest Coalition. So focused on the forest here in northern New Mexico. So my dad was a forester, and I grew up hearing a lot of the same things that I heard from the panelists today. And what always strikes me is the range of questions that these scientists address is so limited. It's focused on fuels. It's focused on efforts to make the fire adapted, and what they mean, of course, is for low intensity fire, the so-called good fires. And this from a larger philosophical perspective, it comes from the agricultural model of the way forests work. And of course, the Forest Service is under the Department of Agriculture, and that's been the case since the early part of the last century. So the agricultural model, of course, is what got us fire suppression and old growth logging policies that targeted the old and mature trees that were desired by the industry. So this overall framework has not really changed, and despite the fact that it's been decried as misguided and short-sighted by almost everyone. So there's one key question that I didn't hear mentioned. Well, it was mentioned briefly, was whether reducing fuels in specific areas by clearing and burning most of the vegetation is feasible, given the very low probability that a treated area will encounter a fire, before the flammable grasses and shrubs occupy the site. That was talked about briefly by Wade Tinkman, but it was quite cursory and didn't really go into depth to the problem. So, of course, this issue is not new. It's been raised for at least a decade, and the response, as we heard today, as in the past, is that we need to treat entire landscapes in order to increase the probability for a treated area to encounter a fire. So let's just look at that, just putting aside for a moment the fact that doing so-called treatments, using this medical model, degrades these climate stress forests that are increasingly stressed by severe fire, insect outbreak, drought, impacts of burning every spring and fall. So what would it cost to quickly transform an entire mountain range into desired conditions? Well, we know what that would cost here on the Santa Fe National Forest. Of course, the infrastructure bill passed a couple of years ago allocated a record $5.5 billion for fuel reduction on the National Forest System. Well, just on the Santa Fe National Forest, in fact, just a portion of the Santa Fe National Forest, about the 400,000 acres they call the dry mixed conifer forest in Ponderosa Pine Forest, it would cost about $1.2 billion to treat that one time. So that's at $2,500 an acre, and that cost is going up. So, that it doesn't cost costs like that are just astronomical if you think about the 156 or so national forests around the country. But that's not it. The our friends at the Santa Fe National Forest a couple years ago started an intentional burn that burned down over 1,000 structures, the largest fire in New Mexico. So far, those landowners have been compensated $4 billion. So that's the cost of one mistake. So I guess I'll just leave it there. This is kind of the elephant in the room that was not addressed by the panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Sam. And then our final panelist is Paula Hood.
Hi there. Thank you. My name is Paula Hood, she, her pronouns. I'm co-director of Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project, and I've been tracking timber sales on national forests and helping with monitoring, such as field surveying and public comments, for about 23 years now in different parts of Oregon. And I have an academic background I have a master's of science in environmental science, and the research that I did for my master's degree focused on the effects of logging on fine sediments and macroinvertebrate communities in small forested streams in Mount Hood. And then I came on as co-director to Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project about 10 years ago. And the heart of the work that we do at Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project is field surveying. So we get out on the ground every summer from the beginning of June through the end of September. And so we really have, and we track timber sales and do field surveying on 4 national forests in Eastern Oregon and Southeastern Washington. And so, and our director has been doing that for over 30 years now, every single summer. And so we have, I think, kind of a unique window into seeing management trends and ecological trends on national forests in relation to timber sales for now decades. So that said, I think what stands out to me about the elephant in the room is the almost complete omission of discussions about anything besides the trees and the species composition and the fire behavior. And so how is it affecting the wildlife habitat, the logging that they're doing? How is it affecting fish, streams, water quality? How is it actually affecting carbon storage, which Chad talked about? But so, and, the values of snag forests, so logging, there's a huge body of evidence showing that all kinds of logging, thinning, management in general, you end up really negatively affecting the presence of key wildlife habitat components. So things like standing dead wood or standing dead trees, down logs, all basically anything that they are targeting as fuels are often the things that wildlife themselves need to live and survive. And so what they are calling fuels is actually wildlife habitat. And so, and consistently in timber sale after timber sale after timber sale, they're below standards for their own forest plan standards for how much of these wildlife habitat components are supposed to be on the landscape. And then they are further degrading those already at a deficit wildlife habitat components. So I think that's a huge issue. They also have very, no real look, and often there's also a severe lack of population density or population data, sorry. So for species such as marten, bull trout, lynx, they don't look at the species that are potentially being affected. They don't have adequate baseline data. So there's almost no mention of the wildlife, the fish, things like that. The water quality, there's also a huge body of information showing that upslope logging, as well as logging near the streams, has severe negative impacts for stream habitats, water quality parameters, temperatures, fine sediments. And so they really are missing the forest through the trees, so to speak. They're missing what is alive about the forest and all of these connections that make the forest a place to live. I like to think of critter condos for a forest. And, wildlife need thermal cover. They need places to hide from predators. They need places to rest. They need places to get out of the elements. And those are often degraded or destroyed in timber sales. And so you lose really what is the forest. Besides this, when you go into recently logged stands, they're often extremely, extremely open, extremely homogeneous, and really lack any of those sorts of areas that wildlife need to thrive and survive in those forests. So those were a couple of the main things. And then also, timber sales need roads. They need lots and lots and lots of roads. And we already have way too many roads. And while roads kind of can be like, oh, what's a road or two? As a couple of examples, the Malheur National Forest and the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest both have over 9,000 miles of roads each. And that's not unusual. There's over 3 miles per square mile of forest on average across those forests for road density. And that is well above their own forest plan standards, well above what they can afford to maintain, well above what is considered safe for fish or often for wildlife. It creates fragmentation, invasive species. Anyway, I'm kind of going on maybe a little too long, but the last thing that I'll wrap up with is that there was a little bit of a mix of how they were presenting. So one of the big things that I also see consistently in timber sales and management proposals is the Forest Service taking the dry forest idea, which is already flawed for all the reasons that we're going to discuss and more, but then they take it and abuse this rationale about frequent fire and how, the landscape's supposed to be frequent fire, low severity fire across these broad areas. And in the webinar just now, they kind of mixed a little bit like what that meant for like high elevation areas. And I just want to be clear that the Forest Service, like when they were rolling back the protections for large trees in Eastern Oregon and southeastern Washington, they simply did not differentiate between drier, lower elevation forests and higher elevation forests. That didn't exist in their analysis at all. And so that's one of the ways that they often end up going into areas that are much more productive, much more moist. And at the end of their webinar, they kind of started hinting at like, oh, well, we need to start thinking about going into these areas, these moist mixed conifer forests that are in higher elevations. Just to be clear, they're already doing that. So in timber sales, we see over and over, they are going into moist mixed conifer forests, they're going into higher elevations, they're actively logging, commercial logging within the riparian protection buffer zones that they themselves were supposed to have as buffers to protect against logging for the streams. They're going after large trees and they're doing logging on very steep slopes. And so they really just failed to paint a clear picture of the logging that's actually happening on the ground and how risky and how destructive it is, as well as the body of science that shows that logging in these areas is very ecologically damaging.
Thank you, Paula. Well, it's really helpful to hear all those things. And I guess I just wanted to highlight 3 things that stood out for me, both from the panel, from the Forest Service webinar, and then from what you all have shared today. Is the first one is that we're seeing the Forest Service going back to its classic narrative that says they make the positive gesture of acknowledging that fire has a role in ecosystems, but then use that as cover for almost a sort of hostage situation of saying, we can't restore fire until we log first. And so Chad's point about the volume of science showing that you can restore fire to ecosystems without logging first, I think is a crucial thing that was missing there. Second is their narrative that says, well, if we don't do anything, things will be worse. And they don't look at their own cumulative mortality. They don't look at how the places that they log, after those places have fire, the combination of the logging and the fire means fewer trees living than the unthinned areas that experience similar fire. So if you want more trees, if you want more habitat, if you want more carbon stored in the forest, you find that in the untreated forest, not the treatment projects. But the only way to show that is when you assess the cumulative mortality, and they don't. They just keep putting blinders on it. And the third thing is the more broad problem of the Forest Service's attitude towards research that debunks their claims. Their approach is to omit to exclude, and to do name calling to stigmatize it. And that sort of approach, as embodied in the webinar we just saw, doesn't work. And if we're going to get real change, we're going to need something different. We're going to need to bring in more voices, like what this webinar series is trying to do. So those are my closing thoughts. Is there anyone else who'd like to add closing thoughts for this webinar?
I want to mention two things that I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, but there are other things that really struck me in terms of major omissions, which is the panelists refused to talk about the abundant body of scientific evidence. Many studies, including Forest Service scientists as authors or co-authors, who were not mentioned or included in today's panel, finding that denser forests, more carbon-rich forests, including in frequent fire forest types, tend to burn at lower intensities in wildfires because of the microclimates that they have, the higher tree density, more of a wind break effect against the winds that drive flames, more cooling shade from the forest canopy, et cetera, and fewer combustible grasses in the understory because there's less sunlight reaching the forest floor. They just refuse to talk about that. Some of the biggest studies and most comprehensive research done on this question has been done by Forest Service scientists who are not included or mentioned today. And they're finding that the denser forests, the more carbon-rich forests actually burn at lower intensities, all things being equal. And I think that's really key. But the same token, the other side of that same coin, they refuse to talk about the abundant science, again, in many cases by Forest Service scientists themselves, finding that removing trees from forests through thinning operations and other types of logging undermines that climate buffer and actually makes fires burn, and undermines the microclimate and makes fires burn faster, spread faster, and oftentimes burn more intensely. So, that I think was a major thing. And the last thing I'll mention is just, there were numerous references to small trees and understory trees. And, this is really, really dishonest, because most of the wood being removed in these so-called thinning projects, most of the carbon being removed from the forest, is in the form of mature and old growth trees. In the Sierra Nevada National Forest, they're going up to 40 inches in diameter at breast height. Trees that are 250, 300 plus years old in many cases, and they're calling it thinning and fuel reduction, and ladder fuel removal. The public is being misled to a massive degree on this, and these folks know what's happening out there, and they're not saying it. So they use phrases like, small trees and underbrush, small trees and underbrush. Totally aside from the fact that you don't have to remove any trees, you can just do burning if you want to do burning. The fact is, when they actually do these thinning projects, they are heavily targeting the mature and old growth trees, and they're being dishonest about it.
Thank you, Chad. Anyone else?
Well, I guess, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Sam.
Getting back to the cost issue again, the traditional way, of course, to pay for these so-called restoration treatments is to sell off big trees, and that brings in receipts to the agency. Well, when you're talking about trillions of dollars, there are not enough big trees out there, especially in a place like the Southwest. We've already logged them all to come close to paying for some of these treatments, again, at about $2,500 per acre. So I just want to mention that, yeah.
And to return to the point I made at the beginning about funding for Home Outward, it's not just these thinning projects aren't just costing taxpayers money, but they're taking resources that could otherwise be used to help communities use a home outward strategy to effectively prepare to safely coexist with wildfires. That's a tragedy of this. Paula, did you have a final comment?
Yeah, well, just to build a little bit on what you said too about, the sort of hostage situation of saying that they can't do fire without logging. I wanted to also note that when you really try to pin the Forest Service down, which I've tried over and over and over to do, to say, okay, well, if you went into this forest area once and thinned it out, which I don't endorse, but let's just say, with logging, and then you burned it, will you commit to not logging it again? And they absolutely will not. the forest supervisors won't, none of the ID team people will, nobody does. And so what is the long-term plan here? Also kind of building on what Chad was saying about the public is being misled. And so not only will they not commit to not repeatedly logging it, but then if it does burn, they often replant it at extremely high stocking densities that they know and admit are going to need to be logged again in the future. And then, on top of that, these, treatments aren't effective more than 10 or 15 years. And so they're going to go in and in and in and in. And then again, that kind of circles back to, what's the long-term plan? Can we have an honest conversation, which I think the answer is no with the Forest Service, about what their long-term planning actually is for these areas? Because ultimately, anybody who's been doing this for decades can see that it is creating situations where logging is supposedly necessary by these rationales over and over and over again. And then, what of the fish? What of the fragmentation? What of the invasives? What of the endangered species? Like, none of these things are addressed.
If I could just make one more quick comment, I just want to, add to what Sam was saying about the costs. This is just one example among many. This is there's a very large logging project on the Plumas National Forest in the northern Sierra Nevada, about 200,000 acres, and the Forest Service is claiming they're doing this backcountry logging, mostly targeting mature and old growth trees, supposedly to protect the community. And so they acknowledged in response to public comments that the science is clear that they don't have to remove any trees before they do burning. They can just do burning alone. They acknowledged that thinning, what they propose to do, is about 6 times more expensive per acre than just doing fire alone. And the total price tag for this thing is $650 million. So something that's not going to stop fires from reaching the towns. We've seen what happens in numerous cases where fires have burned through vast thinned areas before burning down towns, recently in California. And so it won't be effective, but they're spending, $2/3 of $1 billion on this single project. And how many homes could be protected? How many communities? Tens of thousands of homes could be made fire safe with that money. So, to me, I think, and it goes to the point that Doug was making too about the 20th century approach of focusing our attention and our resources on logging projects out in national forests and claiming that's somehow our fire management policy, instead of actually focusing on the communities that are at most at risk from fire, many of which are nowhere near a forest, and making sure that they have the resources and the technical know-how and the support to become fire safe.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Chad. And with that, I think we'll wrap things up. There will be another Forest Service webinar next week, and so we'll be back after that with a new response panel for that latest webinar. So I hope you can come back and join us for that. And thank you to all the presenters today, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.